The morning of June 4, 1942, dawned with an eerie calm over the Pacific waters near Midway Atoll. But Admiral Chester Nimitz knew this tranquility was merely the prelude to one of the most audacious gambles in naval warfare, history. Standing in his Pearl Harbor Command Center, Nimitz stared at intelligence reports that would have made lesser men tremble with fear. The entire Japanese combined fleet, led by Admiral Isoroku Yamamoto himself, was steaming toward Midway, with overwhelming force: 4 aircraft carriers, 11 battleships, and over 200 aircraft against America's meager 3 operational carriers and handful of land-based planes. The hook that would define this battle lay not in superior numbers or firepower, but in a calculated risk so dangerous that it bordered on madness. Station Hypo, the Navy's cryptographic unit in Hawaii, had cracked the Japanese naval code JN-25, revealing Yamamoto's master plan to lure the remaining American Pacific Fleet into a decisive battle. The intelligence was solid, but acting on it required Nimitz to commit his entire remaining naval strength to a battle where defeat would leave the American West Coast virtually defenseless. The Japanese strategy seemed flawless on paper. Yamamoto planned a diversionary attack on the Aleutian Islands to draw American forces north, while his main striking force would capture Midway and destroy any American fleet that dared to respond. The architect of Pearl Harbor believed this would finally bring America to the negotiating table, ending the war on Japanese terms. What Yamamoto didn't know was that his every move was being anticipated by American codebreakers working around the clock in basement rooms beneath Pearl Harbor. Nimitz faced an agonizing decision that would echo through history. His 3 carriers, Enterprise, Hornet, and the hastily repaired Yorktown, carried barely 150 aircraft against the Japanese force of over 300. The conventional wisdom dictated defensive positions, but Nimitz chose the opposite path. He would stake everything on a preemptive strike, positioning his carriers northeast of Midway to catch the Japanese fleet at its most vulnerable moment. The gamble extended beyond mere positioning. Nimitz ordered the damaged Yorktown into battle despite her crew still working frantically to repair bomb damage from the Battle of the Coral Sea just weeks earlier. Dockyard workers had estimated 3 months for proper repairs, but Nimitz gave them 3 days. The carrier limped out of Pearl Harbor with civilian workers still aboard, welding plates and replacing damaged systems even as she steamed toward battle, as per historical accounts documented in Samuel Eliot Morrison's History of United States Naval Operations in World War II. The American decision to commit their entire Pacific carrier force to this single engagement represented the ultimate all-or-nothing strategy. Perhaps the most audacious element of Nimitz's plan involved the timing of the attack. Rather than waiting for the Japanese to strike Midway first, he ordered his pilots to launch while the enemy carriers were refueling and rearming their aircraft after their planned dawn attack on the atoll. This narrow window would leave the Japanese flight decks crowded with fuel lines, ammunition, and vulnerable aircraft. If the Americans could find them in the vast Pacific and coordinate their scattered attack groups without radar guidance or reliable communications, the stage was set for a battle that would pivot on split-second timing, incredible courage, and the kind of calculated risk that either creates legends or destroys fleets entirely. The pre-dawn hours of June 4th brought a tense anticipation aboard the 3 American carriers as they maintained radio silence in their positions northeast of Midway. Admiral Raymond Spruance, commanding Task Force 16 from the Enterprise, and Admiral Frank Jack Fletcher aboard the Yorktown knew they were about to execute one of the most dangerous naval maneuvers ever attempted, launching a coordinated strike against a superior enemy force while remaining undetected. At exactly 4:30 in the morning, Japanese reconnaissance planes lifted off from the cruiser Tone, beginning their search patterns across the empty ocean. Unknown to the Japanese, they were flying directly over the American fleet's position from the previous night, but the carriers had moved under cover of darkness. This timing represented another layer of Nimitz's calculated gamble, positioning his forces just beyond Japanese search ranges, while remaining close enough to launch effective strikes. The deception began in earnest when Midway's defenders launched their first attacks against the incoming Japanese strike force. Brewster Buffalo fighters and Douglas Dauntless dive bombers rose from Midway's airstrip in what appeared to be a desperate defensive measure. In reality, these brave aviators were sacrificing themselves to maintain the illusion that Midway's defenders were fighting alone, with no knowledge of the approaching American fleet. Admiral Nagumo, commanding the Japanese carrier force, fell perfectly into the trap. His morning strike against Midway proceeded as planned, with 108 aircraft pounding the atoll's installations. When Midway's defenders fought back more fiercely than expected, Nagumo made the fateful decision that Nimitz had anticipated. He ordered his reserve aircraft, originally armed with armor-piercing bombs for use against ships, to be rearmed with high-explosive bombs for a second attack on the island. This decision triggered the most vulnerable phase of Japanese carrier operations. Flight decks across all 4 carriers, Akagi, Kaga, Soryu, and Hiryu, became cluttered with fuel lines, ammunition carts, and aircraft in various stages of rearming. The process would take at least an hour, during which the carriers would be sitting ducks if discovered by enemy aircraft. Spruance seized this moment to launch his strike, even though it meant sending his pilots to the absolute limit of their fuel range. At 7 o'clock in the morning, Enterprise and Hornet began launching their attack groups: 37 Dauntless dive bombers, 14 Devastator torpedo bombers, and 20 Wildcat fighters. The math was brutal. His pilots would have barely enough fuel to reach the target area, conduct their attack, and return to their carriers. The coordination required for this strike represented another enormous gamble. Unlike modern naval operations with satellite communications and radar guidance, these pilots would have to find the Japanese fleet using nothing but compass headings, estimated speeds, and dead reckoning across hundreds of miles of empty ocean. A slight miscalculation would send them into the vast Pacific with no way home. Adding to the complexity, Fletcher's Yorktown launched her strike group an hour later, creating the possibility of uncoordinated attacks that could warn the Japanese and allow them to launch their own devastating counterstrike. The American pilots had no way to communicate between attack groups once airborne, making precise timing dependent on individual squadron commanders making split-second decisions over a moving target. As the morning sun climbed higher over the Pacific, 151 American aircraft were spreading across the ocean in what would either be remembered as a brilliant tactical masterstroke or the final desperate act of a doomed fleet. The next few hours would determine not just the outcome of this battle, but potentially the entire course of the Pacific War. The morning sky above the Pacific stretched endlessly blue as Lieutenant Commander John Waldron led his 15 Douglas Devastator torpedo bombers from the Hornet toward what he somehow knew would be his final mission. Waldron had studied Japanese tactics obsessively, and his intuition told him the enemy carriers would be further north than the planned intercept coordinates. Against direct orders, he led Torpedo Squadron 8 on a course that would bring them face to face with destiny. At 9:20 in the morning, Waldron's squadron found the Japanese carrier force exactly where his instincts had predicted. 4 massive carriers steamed in formation, their flight decks still cluttered with aircraft, fuel lines, and ammunition, exactly the vulnerable condition Nimitz had gambled on finding. But Waldron's triumph of navigation became a tragedy of coordination, as his squadron arrived alone, without the planned fighter escort or dive bomber support that might have ensured their survival. The Devastator torpedo bombers, obsolete even by 1942 standards, lumbered toward their targets at barely 150 miles per hour and just above sea level. Japanese Zero fighters swarmed down from above like vengeful wasps, while anti-aircraft fire from every ship in the fleet created a deadly curtain of steel and flame. One by one, Waldron's planes fell into the Pacific, their crews fighting to the end with a courage that would echo through naval history. Ensign George Gay, the sole survivor of Torpedo Squadron 8, watched in horror from his life raft as his 14 squadron mates perished around him. His Devastator had been shot down just short of the carrier Kaga, and from his position in the water, he would witness the entire battle unfold. Gay's survival provided crucial eyewitness testimony that would later help historians understand the precise sequence of events that turned the tide of the Pacific War. The sacrifice of Torpedo Squadron 8 was compounded by the similar fate of Enterprise's Torpedo Squadron 6 and Yorktown's Torpedo Squadron 3. Lieutenant Commander Eugene Lindsay led his 14 Devastators from Enterprise into the same deadly gauntlet, achieving no hits while losing 10 aircraft and 20 crew members. Commander Lance Massey's squadron from Yorktown suffered equally devastating losses, with 12 aircraft shot down and only 5 torpedoes launched, none finding their targets. In just 30 minutes, 3 American torpedo squadrons had been virtually annihilated, with 41 aircraft lost and over 80 aircrew killed or missing. The Japanese defenders celebrated what appeared to be a complete victory, but the torpedo attacks had accomplished something far more valuable than any hits they might have achieved. The low-level assaults had drawn every Japanese fighter down to sea level and pulled the entire fleet's attention away from the high-altitude approaches where the real threat was developing. Admiral Nagumo, observing the seemingly hopeless American attacks, made another fateful decision that played directly into Nimitz's strategy. Convinced that the scattered, uncoordinated strikes represented the entirety of American offensive capability, he ordered his carriers to prepare for their own massive counterstrike against the American fleet. This meant keeping his flight decks cluttered with aircraft, fuel, and ordnance for at least another hour. As referenced in Walter Lord's comprehensive account, Incredible Victory, the timing of these torpedo attacks created the precise conditions that American dive bomber pilots needed for their decisive strike. The courage of the torpedo squadron crews was not measured in ships sunk or damage inflicted, but in the precious time they bought with their lives. Their sacrifice drew the Japanese fleet into the exact position and condition that Nimitz's gamble required. Carriers loaded with fuel and ammunition, fighters at low altitude, and attention focused away from the high-altitude threat that was about to descend upon them. Unknown to the dying torpedo bomber crews, their heroic sacrifice was about to be vindicated in the most spectacular fashion imaginable. At precisely 10:22 in the morning, Lieutenant Commander Wade McCluskey, leading Enterprise's dive bomber squadron, spotted the white wake of a Japanese destroyer racing northward across the blue Pacific. The destroyer Arashi had been depth-charging the submarine USS Nautilus and was now hurrying to rejoin the main fleet. McCluskey made a split-second decision that would alter the course of World War II. He followed that wake like a highway pointing directly to the Japanese carriers. After 2 hours of fruitless searching across empty ocean, McCluskey's 37 Dauntless dive bombers were running critically low on fuel. Many pilots were already calculating whether they had enough gas to return to Enterprise, and some were preparing to ditch in the Pacific rather than risk their carrier by attempting a landing with empty tanks. The sight of the Japanese fleet, spread out in perfect formation below, was like a miracle to the exhausted American aviators. The timing was absolutely perfect. Nagumo's carriers had just completed recovering their midway strike force and were in the midst of the complex process of refueling, rearming, and spotting aircraft for the planned attack on the American fleet. Flight decks were crowded with aircraft, fuel lines snaked across wooden planking, and ammunition was stacked in neat piles beside each plane. The carriers were floating bombs waiting for a spark. McCluskey split his force between the 2 nearest carriers. He led his section of 37 bombers against the flagship Akagi, while Lieutenant Richard Best's section targeted Kaga. The dive bombers pushed over from 14,000 feet, screaming down at nearly vertical angles while Japanese anti-aircraft gunners desperately tried to track targets moving at over 300 miles per hour. At exactly the same moment, completely by coincidence, Lieutenant Commander Maxwell Leslie's dive bombers from Yorktown arrived over the scene and immediately targeted the carrier Soryu. The 3 squadrons attacked simultaneously, achieving the kind of perfect coordination that no amount of planning could have guaranteed. In naval aviation, such timing is measured in seconds, and these attacks were synchronized as if choreographed by fate itself. The first bomb to find its target struck Akagi's flight deck at 10:26 in the morning, detonating directly among the aircraft being prepared for takeoff. The explosion ignited aviation fuel and set off a chain reaction of secondary explosions that turned the entire hangar deck into an inferno. Admiral Nagumo, watching from Akagi's bridge, saw his flagship transformed into a blazing wreck in a matter of seconds. Kaga suffered an even more devastating fate when multiple bombs crashed through her flight deck and exploded in the hangar spaces below. Fully fueled aircraft and stacked ammunition created an unstoppable fire that quickly spread throughout the ship. Within minutes, the carrier that had participated in the attack on Pearl Harbor was burning from stem to stern, her crew abandoning ship as explosions rocked her hull. Soryu lasted only slightly longer. Leslie's dive bombers scored 3 direct hits that penetrated to her engine spaces and ruptured fuel tanks throughout the ship. The carrier lost power and steering almost immediately, leaving her dead in the water and burning fiercely. Her experienced air crews, veteran of campaigns across the Pacific, found themselves swimming in oil-slicked water as their ship broke apart beneath them. In just 5 minutes, from 10:22 to 10:27 in the morning on June 4th, 1942, 3 of Japan's 4 fleet carriers had been reduced to burning wrecks. The ships that had spearheaded the attack on Pearl Harbor, conquered the Dutch East Indies, and dominated the Pacific for 6 months, were now funeral pyres drifting powerlessly across the ocean. The mathematical precision of this destruction was staggering. The Japanese had lost over 200 aircraft, including many of their most experienced pilots, along with 3 irreplaceable fleet carriers. The American cost was measured in minutes of fuel, and a handful of aircraft lost to anti-aircraft fire during the diving attacks. The smoke from 3 burning Japanese carriers had barely begun to dissipate when Admiral Nagumo faced the stark reality of his situation. His flagship Akagi was a blazing wreck, forcing him to transfer his flag to the cruiser Nagara while his staff attempted to comprehend the magnitude of the disaster. Only 1 carrier remained operational, Hiryu, under the command of Rear Admiral Tamon Yamaguchi, steaming alone amid the funeral pyres of her sister ships. Yamaguchi, recognizing that his single carrier represented Japan's last hope for salvaging anything from this catastrophe, immediately launched every aircraft he could muster. At 10:54 in the morning, 18 dive bombers and 6 fighters roared off Hiryu's deck, followed later by 10 torpedo bombers and 6 more fighters. Their target was the American carrier Yorktown, identified by reconnaissance aircraft as the closest enemy vessel. The Japanese counterstrike found Yorktown at approximately noon, catching her in the midst of refueling operations much as the American dive bombers had found the Japanese carriers. The first wave of attackers, led by Lieutenant Michio Kobayashi, pressed home their assault with the same suicidal determination that had characterized Japanese attacks throughout the Pacific campaign. 3 bombs crashed through Yorktown's flight deck, starting fires and damaging her boilers enough to reduce her speed to just 6 knots. Captain Elliot Buckmaster's damage control teams performed miracles of seamanship, restoring power and getting Yorktown moving again within an hour. When the second Japanese strike arrived at 2:45 in the afternoon, they found what appeared to be an undamaged American carrier steaming at normal speed. The deception worked perfectly until 2 torpedoes from Lieutenant Commander Yahachi Tanabe's attack group slammed into Yorktown's port side, flooding her engine rooms and leaving her dead in the water with a severe list. The apparent success of the Japanese counterattack masked a deeper strategic failure. While Hiryu's pilots celebrated hitting an American carrier, they had failed to locate or attack Enterprise and Hornet, which remained fully operational and hungry for revenge. Admiral Spruance, now commanding the American task force after Fletcher transferred to a cruiser when Yorktown was abandoned, prepared to eliminate the last Japanese carrier. At 4:30 in the afternoon, 24 dive bombers from Enterprise, led by Lieutenant Wilmer Gallagher, found Hiryu attempting to recover her surviving aircraft. The carrier was in the same vulnerable condition that had doomed her sister ships, flight deck crowded with aircraft, fuel lines exposed, and ammunition stockpiled for the next strike. Gallagher's bombers pushed over in steep dives, and within minutes, 4 direct hits had transformed Hiryu into the 4th Japanese carrier funeral pyre of the day. As documented in Gordon Pranga's definitive account, Miracle at Midway, the destruction of all 4 Japanese fleet carriers within a single day represented an unprecedented naval disaster that fundamentally altered the balance of power in the Pacific. Admiral Yamaguchi chose to go down with his ship, sending a final message to Yamamoto that captured the magnitude of Japan's defeat. There is such a thing as fate. The admiral who had fought so brilliantly throughout the day remained on Hiryu's bridge as she slipped beneath the Pacific waves just after 5 in the morning on June 5th. Yamamoto, monitoring the disaster from his command ship 300 miles away, finally grasped the scope of the catastrophe. His carefully planned operation to destroy the American Pacific Fleet had instead resulted in the annihilation of Japan's own carrier striking force. With his 4 best carriers sunk and over 200 aircraft lost along with many of his most experienced pilots, Yamamoto made the painful decision to cancel the Midway operation and withdraw his remaining forces. The gamble that had seemed so risky just 24 hours earlier had paid off beyond Nimitz's wildest expectations. In exchange for one carrier badly damaged and later sunk by a Japanese submarine, the Americans had eliminated Japan's ability to conduct major offensive operations in the Pacific. The Pacific sun set on June 4, 1942, illuminating a transformed strategic landscape where the balance of naval power had shifted decisively in favor of the United States. Admiral Nimitz's unprecedented gamble had succeeded beyond all reasonable expectations, but the true cost of victory extended far beyond the tactical losses suffered by both fleets during those crucial hours of combat. The human price paid by American air crews was staggering in its immediacy and heartbreaking in its specificity. Of the 41 torpedo bombers that had launched that morning, only 6 returned to their carriers. Torpedo Squadron 8 was entirely eliminated except for Ensign George Gay, floating alone in the Pacific amid the debris of his squadron mates. The names of these young men, Lieutenant Commander John Waldron, Ensign William Evans, aviation machinist's mate Donald Lovelace, represented individual tragedies multiplied across 3 squadrons of America's finest naval aviators. Yet their sacrifice had purchased something invaluable: the complete destruction of Japan's carrier aviation capability. The 4 fleet carriers lost at Midway, Akagi, Kaga, Soryu, and Hiryu, had taken over 4 years to build and represented the core of Japanese naval aviation since the mid-1930s. More critically, the experienced air crews who perished with these ships could not be replaced within the time frame that Japan's strategic situation demanded. The mathematics of replacement revealed the true magnitude of Japan's defeat. American shipyards were already laying down keels for Essex-class carriers that would enter service in 1943 and 1944, while Japanese industrial capacity could barely maintain existing ship construction schedules. The trained pilots lost at Midway had required years of peacetime training that Japan could no longer afford, while American flight training programs were expanding rapidly to meet wartime demands. Captain Mitsuo Fuchida, who had led the Pearl Harbor attack and was aboard Akagi during the battle, later reflected on the psychological impact of the defeat. The Japanese combined fleet had operated with supreme confidence for 6 months, conquering territory from the Aleutians to the Indian Ocean without significant losses. The sudden destruction of their primary striking force in a single day shattered the myth of Japanese invincibility and forced a fundamental reassessment of their strategic position. The intelligence triumph that had made American victory possible also established patterns that would influence the remainder of the Pacific War. Station Hypo's code-breaking success proved that American technological and analytical capabilities could overcome Japanese numerical superiority through superior information. This lesson would be applied repeatedly as American forces began their island-hopping campaign across the Central Pacific. Admiral Yamamoto's reaction to the defeat revealed his understanding of its broader implications. In a private letter to a friend, he wrote that Japan had awakened a sleeping giant and filled him with terrible resolve, recognizing that the industrial capacity of the United States would inevitably overwhelm Japanese resources in a prolonged conflict. The 6 months of victory following Pearl Harbor had been Japan's only opportunity to force a negotiated peace, and that opportunity had died in the flames of the 4 carriers at Midway. The strategic consequences rippled outward immediately. Plans for Japanese expansion into the South Pacific were canceled, allowing American forces to begin their offensive operations in the Solomon Islands just 2 months later. The Japanese Navy, forced into defensive operations, would never again possess the offensive capability to threaten major American installations or disrupt Allied supply lines across the Pacific. Nimitz's gamble had transformed the Pacific War from a desperate American holding action into the beginning of an inexorable advance toward the Japanese home islands. The calculated risk taken on June 4, 1942, had purchased not just tactical victory, but strategic initiative that would carry American forces across the Pacific and ultimately to Tokyo Bay 3 years later.